at the National Press Club the Communications Minister, Mitch Fifield. The Turnbull government has ticked off on sweeping changes to Australia's media laws, but Senator Fifield must now persuade the Parliament. If he does, it could trigger a big shake-up. Mitch Fifield with today's National Press Club address.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. I'm Chris Uhlmann, and if you are following us online, this being about media today, then our hashtag is NPC and our Twitter handle is @PressClubAUST. And our guest today is the Minister for Communications and the Arts, Mitch Fifield. You know, in state governments of yesteryear, if a Premier really wanted to nobble an up-and-comer, they'd usually give them the portfolio of health, therefore miring them forever in intractable waiting lists questions and having to explain away unfortunate deaths. And I was wondering if there was something similar in the federal scene that could be considered a similar kind of job. And I think that might be Communications Minister tasked with delivering media reform. And I try to imagine the conversation as Mitch Fifield enters the Prime Minister's office and is offered the opportunity of negotiating new media laws with a powerful group of angry billionaires who loathe each other, who have commanded an army of journalists standing ready to tear the minister limb from limb. And as he digests that thought and sees the burning wreck of his career light up in his imagination, the PM adds, "Oh, and could you try to mediate between the right wing of the party and the ABC?" And as he's leaving the office, the Prime Minister calls out, "Oh, and by the way, would you mind being manager for government business in the Senate?" Such is the lot of Mitch Fifield, and yet can I say he has managed all these tasks with an efficiency and good grace that's become his hallmark. Let's hear what he has to say today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be back at the National Press Club, and can I thank the club for allowing me, as Manager of Government Business in the Senate, some brief respite from the Australian Senate. The last time I was at the Press Club in 2013 was in my former capacity as Minister for Disabilities and Ageing. And I must say, back at that time, one of the challenges was drumming up interest in my portfolio responsibilities. It seems to be a problem I don't have anymore. Indeed, such is the level of interest in the portfolio that I often read about what my own thoughts are before I've actually had them. But just as a sidebar, can I note that I think it's a pity that something which is the core business of government, that is providing extra support to people who face challenges for reasons beyond their control, such as disability, is an area that doesn't always receive the attention that it warrants. But I should acknowledge that the Canberra Press Gallery over recent years has done much to lift the profile of disability as an issue. To my current portfolio, I should acknowledge at the outset one particular person, and that is Julie Flynn, a former president of the Canberra Press Gallery, who has just announced that after 15 years she's stepping down as Chief Executive of Free TV. Something that I realised fairly early in my tenure as Communications Minister is that Free TV and Astra, which is the subscription television peak body, are a bit like the Capulets and the Montagues. Harold Mitchell, who's with us today, is Lord Capulet. Tony Shepherd, I think, is Lord Montague, which makes Julie Flynn Tybalt, and Andrew Maiden Benvolio. Julie, best wishes to you for the future. Can I also acknowledge the Secretary of my department, Heather Smith, and also Ben Roberts-Smith, VC, who is with us. I see my role as Minister for Communications and the Arts as essentially having responsibility for both the sinews and the soul of the nation. The sinews through the communications portfolio and the soul through the arts. The sinews is that which is essential, connective and often unseen. And the soul, well, the closest that a minister comes to having that responsibility in a pluralistic secular democracy is the Arts Minister. So, as Communications Minister, mine is really an enabling portfolio to create an environment where people, businesses, consumers can configure and interact as they see fit. Our agenda in government, as you would have heard, is about managing a transitioning economy, and the communications portfolio is both a mechanism to assist in the management of that transition, but it's also a transitioning sector in its own right. And reforming media law is an important part of this transition. So I can think of no more fitting place to be today in that regard than at the National Press Club. You are an industry that has gone through rapid and major change. Unfortunately, when it comes to media law, there are a number of things that have been stuck for a long time, like a faulty dial on an old analogue TV. And if I can pose a question to you, I wonder how many of you can remember 1987. I suspect that many of you who are around my age can, like me, you're in a bit of a demographic lock, trapped in 1987. Others, and for the sake of argument, let's call them the BuzzFeed generation, for instance, probably weren't even born in 1987. But for those of you who were, let me refresh your memories. Kylie Minogue still lived at Ramsay Street and was singing The Locomotion. Alan Border led Australia to victory in the World Cup in a place that was still called Calcutta. Oliver Stone's Platoon won the Oscar for Best Picture. I was finishing my degree at Sydney Uni. Meanwhile, the first mobile phone call in Australia was made by the Managing Director of the then Telecom Australia. The internet was in its infancy, the iPhone was still a couple of decades away, and the world was still 11 years from hearing the name Google. 1987, hard for some to believe, including myself, was a long time ago. Yet much of the law that governs media dates back to that year. Now, these laws have been tinkered with, but they remain largely unaltered. The media landscape, in contrast, is unrecognisable. And we all would have heard the term digital disruption. And I guess the first point I want to make is that it's not really technology that's disruptive, it's the imaginations of individuals who seek to apply technology and new technology in different ways. But it also troubles me that disruption is seen as a negative word, that it implies that change is somehow bad. Whereas I think technology and the way it's changing lives is one of the most overwhelming forces for good in human history. Our lives are easier, we're more productive, people are more connective, and that's all good. And it's a big part of the story of recent human prosperity. But for consumers in particular, it has given greater power and greater choice. It's posed challenges for government and business as a result, and we all understand this, and you particularly understand it if you run a printing business that produces phone books, or you're a taxi driver, you run a bookstore, a DVD rental business, or a travel agency. And in my own portfolio, Exhibit A in terms of a disrupted business is Australia Post. Its forebear, the Postmaster General's Department, was the NBN of its time. In fact, so fundamental was the Postmaster General's Department to communications that until 1975, the person who holds my office was known as the Postmaster General. In fact, it's a cute title that I'm thinking of bringing back. Australians are now sending 1.4 billion fewer letters per year than they were in 2008. That's down 47%. There are now 70 million fewer visits to post offices each year than there were 7 years ago. Australians are communicating over the internet, and letter volumes have now fallen to the level that they were in 1995. Meanwhile, Post is transforming itself into an e-commerce company, and an indication of this is that 75% of the parcels delivered by Post last year originate from online shopping, and Australians spent $17.3 billion shopping online last year. And I can remember my grandmother who used to refuse to pay her utilities bills any way other than catching the train into town to pay them in person. Eventually she was persuaded to use the post, And if she was around today, no doubt she would be paying her bills online. Everyone ultimately catches up with the fact that change is required. Change is remorseless. Our media laws are a relic of a bygone era. They were designed for an environment that no longer exists. And just like the cathode ray tubes that we've all thrown on the nature strip in years gone by, so too must these media laws be dispensed with. Now, the journalists here today will understand particularly well that the media sector was one of the first to really feel the effects of digital disruption, and newspapers in particular were at the cutting edge. Unlike many other forms of online content, news is expensive, it's labour intensive, it takes time, it takes resources. So news organisations have had to find resources, they've had to further commercialise their online offerings, and newsrooms around the world have felt the impact of these changes. And the environment we have today, it's driven by the choices that consumers are making, very different to 1987. Some good indicators of this. Close to half of all Australians actually identify online sources of news, including social media, as their main source of news. At the end of last year, major mastheads reached over 50% of their audiences via their website or app in an average week. And online or predominantly online sources, which compete for Australian readers, as you know, now include many mastheads of the online variety, which are relatively new, with which we're all familiar. And that online access is also changing the way that people engage with news content. And it's notable that, according to Nielsen, consumers who access online news spend a greater amount of time reading news compared to those that read printed newspapers. The other big change in the way Australians engage with news and entertainment services relates to social media, with networks such as Facebook and Twitter used as pathways to news, but also as tools for consumers to curate and share content with others. And some 82% of Australians have an active social media profile in 2014, and 7 in 10 are active on Facebook, and with 52% sharing content. This does reflect a broader trend from passive to active engagement with media content. In 2015, 59% of Australians accessed news on a weekly basis from smartphones, and this is higher than citizens in the US, the UK, France, Germany and Japan. In this environment, newspapers are under pressure, and we do see similar pressures affecting Australian broadcasters. Traditional commercial radio and television platforms remain profitable and do continue to attract large audiences. But new technologies are giving consumers access to other types of content, which creates more competition for audiences. And a clear example of this is the way Australians are embracing subscription video on-demand services. At the end of 2015, over 2.7 million Australians had Netflix. The demand for streaming continues to grow. One of Netflix's local competitors, Stan, has claimed demand for their product may rise to 4 million households within the next 4 years. In the United States, on some estimates, Netflix accounts for 37% of that nation's entire internet traffic. And new media formats also have the capacity to challenge commercial radio. Apple exceeded 1 billion podcast downloads in 2013 and then went on to exceed 7 billion in 2014. Apple Music now claim to have over 10 million paid subscribers to the service, challenging the market leader Spotify with its 20 million paying subscribers. The consequences for, I won't say traditional media, let me say media of long standing, has been borne out in their advertising revenues. In 2005, newspapers had around 37% of the advertising pie. Today their share hovers just above 15%. TV advertising has had a more modest fall in share, while radio has remained relatively stable. Online advertising has grown from 6.1% in 2005 to 36.2% in 2014. And in real terms, commercial television broadcasting revenues fell by 20% in the 10 years to 2014. This is the environment that the more long-established platforms are operating in, and it's a market defined by unparalleled choice across multiple platforms. The current media regulations that I'm seeking to remove are a pair of cast iron shackles. They're a pair of cast iron shackles on competition, and I think they're to the detriment of media of long standing. As many of you would know, currently the media control rules that we have are based on 5 numerical tests. These rules were a proxy for media diversity, and because of the historical dominance of newspapers, commercial radio and TV, they only apply to these 3 platforms. They were designed for the princes of print and the queens of screen, as Paul Keating put it. Under these rules, you would know, we have the 75% audience reach rule, the 2 out of 3 rule, we have the 5-4 or minimum voices rule, we have the 1 to a market rule, and the rule that relates to only having 2 commercial radio broadcasting licences in the one area. Now, if you try to explain these rules to someone below the age of 30, why they're needed and what their purpose is, you get blank looks, so don't bother trying. For a while, these rules were relevant, they were appropriate, but technology has rendered them progressively more redundant. So we're seeking to get rid of the reach rule, we're seeking to get rid of the 2 out of 3 rule, and I've made the case on many occasions that these rules now impede traditional media, long-standing media, from competing on the modern media landscape. Today, any of us can use smart TV to quickly skip from a regulated commercial TV service, restricted to less than 75% of the population, to an online service that is not regulated and can be accessed all over the world. In any commercial radio licence area, we can use our tablet, computer or smartphone to access news, high-definition video, social media, blogs, political commentary, documentaries, spanning the entire political spectrum. Yet, we restrict Australian media organisations from cross-media ownership in the name of diversity. And I've argued that a defining feature of the digital age is the diverse range of views that consumers can access from anywhere at any time on a range of networked devices. Getting rid of reach, getting rid of 2 out of 3 will allow media organisations to configure themselves in ways that best suit them. Now, whenever you talk about changes to media law, understandably, people in regional areas get concerned. They jealously guard and value their local media services. It's been something that's been raised with me by my Liberal and National colleagues. I've listened to their concerns, which is why the package that I'm putting forward has important local content protections, that newly merged entities will have higher baseline local content requirements, and in large regional population centres where there are currently no local content requirements, a new minimum will be introduced for the first time. And also for the first time, regional broadcasters who reconfigure will be provided with incentives through the points system to encourage them to produce content locally. I think these protections are an important message for the industry, that the government recognises the importance of local content, and an important message for communities that this government wants to make sure that you continue to have your stories told in your area. But even if you have the best local content rules in the world, they're absolutely meaningless if you don't have strong and viable media organisations who can provide that content. And that's something that regional communities recognise. Now, we have announced what we're taking to the Parliament, and as Chris said, attention rightly turns to the passage of that through the Parliament. We have, as a government, responded to the opposition and the crossbench and their desire to have a Senate committee look at what we're putting forward, and that's currently underway. It's clear from the public comments of most protagonists that there is broad support for removal of the reach rule, but there is some hesitation in some quarters about the removal of the 2 out of 3 rule on the grounds that it retains an important protection for diversity. Now, this is an argument that I find a little difficult to understand. What is the justification for keeping a rule that pretends that the internet doesn't exist? What is the point of keeping a rule that pretends there are only 3 media platforms in place? And why should Australian domestic media organisations be held hostage to rules that don't apply to their international competitors? We've got to give Australian media organisations the opportunity to compete against global giants, and that's a daunting task. If you just look at the market capitalisation of all the major listed Australian commercial broadcasters, it's less than $5 billion. Netflix alone has a market cap of $58 billion. Facebook, $432 billion. Apple and Google each have a market cap over $700 billion. So we need to afford our media organisations the opportunity to compete and to structure themselves the way that best suits them. Also, is put forward the argument that there's a distinction between diversity of content and diversity of ownership. But the point is, our major sources of news already display diverse ownership, which I don't think would significantly change. And just take online news sources as an example. According to Nielsen online ratings data for January, there were 41 news websites with over 300,000 unique visitors in that month. Of those 41 news websites, 19 or 46% are international, in other words, not owned by Australian media companies. Of the top 10 websites, there were 4 international sites not owned by traditional media companies. The ABC had 1. And the other 5 were owned by 4 of Australia's traditional media companies. And even with 2 out of 3 removed and consolidation occurring, there would still be significant ownership diversity amongst Australian news sources. Also, the 2 out of 3 rule has little relevance to most regional areas, and that's because most regional newspapers aren't regulated because they don't meet the threshold to be an associated newspaper. In any event, the government is retaining the other 3 diversity rules to ensure a minimum number of traditional media voices in markets and limits to ownership of TV and radio licences. Now, to be fair, there are varying degrees of enthusiasm amongst media organisations for this package, from those who welcome it to those who would like us to go further. But there is unanimity in one respect, and that is if the package is to go forward, then 2 out of 3 and Reach must both be removed. My firm belief is that the entire package is important. It's not the government's intention to split it. It should pass in its entirety. And there's one other aspect of the debate that does concern me, and that is that I think there might be some who approach this on the basis of emotion rather than reason. The fact is that some people instinctively react against media law because they think it may assist a particular media company or a particular proprietor, and I fear that this approach might be alive and well amongst a few analogue warriors in Canberra. It would be disappointing, it would be illogical to reject the reform package on this basis. It would be emoting at its worst. The strong and near unanimous support for the removal of 2 out of 3 and Reach amongst media organisations ought to dispel any notion that this is about any one particular media organisation. We haven't crafted this package with particular ownership outcomes in mind. I've often said I am ownership agnostic. We just want to give companies the freedom to be what they want to be. So I was very heartened, I must say, to see my counterpart, Joe Sinclair, recently say, if you make decisions based on one media company or another, then you're not doing your job properly. And I hope the Senate follows Joe Sinclair's advice. Reform is not an exercise in doing everything at once and then not touching it for years. It is an ongoing and an incremental process. Rome wasn't built in a day, and no one argued that because Rome couldn't be built in a day, that the construction of Rome shouldn't start. Can I just say in conclusion that I've been extremely pleased with the consultation process through this exercise. It hasn't been done to tick a box, and I think it has resulted in a much better package. I've said before I arrived in the role as Minister for Communications that much of the ground had already been tilled by my predecessor as Communications Malcolm Turnbull, and I thank him for his work in this area. I should also acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues who took a particular interest and assisted in the guidance of this particular exercise. Dean Smith, the Chair of the Government Communications Committee, and also my portfolio colleague, the Minister for Regional Communications, Senator Nash. Can I say I think I have, as a result of this portfolio, a deeper respect for those of you here who are working journalists and the competitive environment that you work in, the challenges that you've faced. I know that you recognise, like me, that the opportunities far outweigh the challenges that are presented. It's my hope that the package that we're putting forward will be good news for consumers, good news for media organisations. This is part of our efforts to recognise that we are in a transitioning economy and to make sure that we're best placed to deal with that. Thanks very much.